President Trump threatening bold new action in the fight over border security. Trump saying he'll shut down the southern border amid new warnings about a wave of immigrants overwhelming the system. The president already cutting foreign aid to 3 Central American countries, Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador this weekend. This comes as Border Patrol agents expect to see over 100,000 apprehensions in March alone. That's the highest in over a decade. And the Customs and Border Patrol Commissioner saying the situation is at a breaking point and that he's, quote, never seen anything like this before. Homeland Security Secretary Kirstjen Nielsen announcing she is ordering hundreds of additional agents to the border to deal with the problem. This latest potential move by President Trump is igniting fierce debate from both sides.
It certainly isn't a bluff. You can take the president seriously. And this president is looking at the metrics.
When the president says he's going to close the border, that is a totally unrealistic boast on his part.
The Democrats will not give us any additional money to do this. They won't give us any additional people. And importantly, they will not change the law that is acting as this giant magnet for people from South and Central America to come into this country.
Well, we're going to do everything we can to stop it. It's totally absurd.
What are we supposed to do? You have the Mexican government allowing thousands of people to walk all across Mexico. They provide them buses. They drop them off at the border, and they say, here, United States, deal with this problem.
Pete, we got a very serious problem. You have the Secretary of Homeland Security saying, I can't guarantee that I can protect the country. I can't guarantee who's coming in. You have now this Border Patrol guys saying they've never seen anything like it. They're completely overwhelmed. This is like a cry for help. And Washington is actually where the problem could be solved. But they're throwing up their hands.
But they're throwing up their hands, including former Obama administration officials like Jay Johnson coming out this weekend saying it is a crisis. 1,000 a day when I was the DHS secretary would have been a bad day.
Yep.
Now we've got 4,000 a day. To not call it a crisis is to just totally deny reality.
Even Bernie Sanders, though, did call it a crisis this weekend.
But they call it a different kind of a crisis in a certain sense. They don't see it as a law and order crisis. They don't see it as a reflection of the fact that this president's been serious about this problem and Congress never has been. And why do we keep trying to do things that don't work? On the questions of aid to Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras. You have leaders of those countries that are helping to facilitate their citizens to leave those countries through Mexico to our country. Yet we spend hundreds of millions of dollars, billions over years, trying to fix their governmental structures and their economy so that we don't have this problem. At what point do you say, this aid isn't working, so we're going to curtail it because it's not helping us improve the situation on our border?
Two of those governments are center-right and are supportive of the United States. And I don't know, how do you feel about cutting off the aid? Do you think that will actually help us or backfire?
It'll backfire tremendously. Look at the percentage of where the money goes, Dana. It's like 40% of the money goes to economic aid to try to stabilize and help those economies grow so people can have jobs there. More than half of the money goes to either law enforcement or crime suppression, in other words, dealing with gangs and the like. So again, that makes people feel safer there, less violence there, less likely to decide that it's worth their time to enter into a trip.
But they are leaving in droves.
Fleeing, well, even more than ever.
Because, again, and, you know, Dana's here. She's made this point on the show repeatedly. We need to invest in those countries substantially as a first step to stop people from making that trip. But I would say this. I don't think closing the border is going to help us if the problem is the humanitarian crisis. I think that more people will come to the border if they say, oh, the border's being closed, the border's closed, and then you're going to have to detain more people. And we know the big problem here, this is what people are talking about, Pete, is that we don't have the facilities or the staff to deal with this.
Because the Democrats don't want to fund it.
They do want to fund it, but they don't want to play what has been Donald Trump's cruel politics of family separation.
Well, that's
telling
this
people,
is the frustrating
oh, we have
part,
a wall.
right?
That just doesn't work.
That's it,
What's
Lisa.
your solution?
Well, Dana, what I think President Trump is doing right now is trying to put as much pressure on Congress to actually do something, because there are easy solutions to try to solve this problem with this influx of Central Americans seeking asylum in the country. You can do things like the Flores Decree. You can close loopholes, like a loophole in the 2008 anti-human trafficking law that changes the way, differentiates the way you treat Central American unaccompanied minors versus those coming from Mexico. There's things that Congress can do. Or look at our asylum and look at the disconnect between the amount of people that pass that initial screening, but just a really small amount, like 9%, that actually get granted asylum in the courts. But instead, Congress has been making the problem worse. And we see that with the conferee solution that came for DHS funding. And essentially what they did is you had Democrats trying to reduce the amount of ICE detention bills. You had them tying the hands of President Trump in both funding for a wall and the way that he could build the wall, and then even things like Section 224, which essentially gives deportation immunity to potential sponsors with unaccompanied minors. So instead of helping the situation, Congress has made it worse.
Well, that is sometimes the way it works.
No, Congress making it worse? What's in our water?
I know you're shocked, Tyrus.
Okay, what do you think about the shutting down of the border? That's a
Financially, that's dangerous for us. But
yeah.
There's a crisis within a crisis, and we don't have enough Border Patrol agents to cover this. So what we're doing is we're taking them away from our sea and airports to where we protect around to go to this situation, which is leaving us vulnerable. And I was doing some investigating, and the hiring process is broken to get these Border Patrol agents out there. 9 out of 10 applicants fail the polygraph, which means it's really, like, if they make, especially with our veterans a lot of times are turned away because one of the questions, like, have you ever killed anyone? And someone in combat has a combat kill, they're automatically disqualified. So getting...
Is that right?
That's, according to my source, yes. That's wild to me.
We're going to have to look into that.
Yeah.
We need to look into that.
We would have to look into that.
Yeah. So,
those are the guys we want.
But, and also I've heard that the morale for the people that are there is really low.
Well, they're exhausted. And there's some rumors that the last time during the shutdown they haven't been paid yet, the back hours. So there's a lot of things going on, a crisis within a crisis, and then on top of that, Congress has to do a lot of things. One, they've got to fix those visa loopholes because most of our illegal immigrants are coming over legally. They're just not going back. So that's another big issue. So there's a lot of things going on. And on top of all of that, speaking of crisis, while we're dealing with all the stuff on our borders, let's not forget our farmers. Let's not forget those floods. Like, we have a lot of crises right now that we don't need arguing in politics.
Yep, and that money is being
decisions.
Voted on.
Yes.
But by the way, just going back to where you started, Tyrus, which was economically, what an impact this is going to have on commerce. Our third largest trading partner is Mexico.
But why are we worried about Mexico?
Hang on, let me finish.
The point is, my focus is on the Americans whose jobs are being taken away through wages.
Guess what, Pete?
Being driven
it's
down
going to hurt American jobs. It's going to hurt American jobs because people will be put out of work.
So you're going
to lose in terms of skyrocketing prices on cars, alcohol, produce. People are saying in 3 weeks we're not going to have avocados.
Well, it's not. It is a big decision. That's not
what
without
would the liberals do without avocado toast?
Without avocados.
But this is the frustration.
Actually, that was wrong.
But I think this is the frustration of President Trump because people are acknowledging now that there actually is a crisis on the southern border. Jay Johnson, who previously
have that
served,
actually. Do you mind if I interrupt and play that?
It.
We have the sound from former DHS Secretary Jay Johnson.
By anyone's definition, by any measure, right now we have a crisis at our southern border. According to the commissioner of CBP, there were 4,000 apprehensions in one day alone this past week, and we're on pace for 100,000 apprehensions on our southern border this month. That is by far a greater number than anything I saw on my watch in my 3 years as Secretary of Homeland Security.
No, I mean, it probably helps to hear from the guy himself. But as he laid out there, this is worse than what he saw when he served as DHS Secretary. So I think the fact that he's entering the fray, he's going on TV, he's talking about this crisis, one, is acknowledgement of the fact that there really is a lot going on at the southern border that we need to be paying attention to. And it lends a lot of credibility because the left and the media cannot say that this is manufactured crisis from President Trump with him weighing in.
It's not a caravan. It's not an invasion.
It sure is, and we mentioned
it's an invasion.
I think 100,000 people a month is a lot.
I hate the word invasion.
We don't know who they are.
Those standards,
we barely know why they're coming.
are at a low point, Pete.
They exploit our laws.
Pete, I don't know who you're talking
violence,
about.
Drug violence, human trafficking.
Pete, this is the
we live in an era of terrorism.
This is demonizing.
But
I'm
most
not demonizing anybody.
Come
to our country legally.
But there's a way, one of the best ways to deal with it would be the asylum.
You're saying fine. You're saying fine. Well, that fine's not an answer.
Wait a second. Most of these people are families and children applying for asylum. That's legal.
And most of them are rejected.
Law.
Most of them are rejected.
Fine, but it's legal to apply.
But one of the things that the Congress could fix this by the end of the week, which is the asylum law piece. That piece of it, you could fix that and then deal with all of these other things and the descriptions and everything. That actually could help everybody, including those children who should not be put in that dangerous position. All right, next, a brand new.
DHS Secretary Kirstjen Nielsen sending out a release this morning saying that they are in urgent need of surging their forces on the border. So here's what DHS is going to do. They're going to accelerate a plan to redeploy up to 750 Customs and Border Protection personnel to assist the Border Patrol. That number may increase to more than 2,000 rather. They're going to immediately expand migrant protection protocols. That's where people claiming asylum are returned to Mexico to await await adjudication. DHS is directing CBP to return hundreds of additional migrants per day above their current rates. Now, Democrats continue to resist the president's call to build a border wall. At the same time, Mexico is not doing a whole lot to stop these caravans from coming through their country toward the U.S. border. The president tweeting his frustration on both those fronts this morning, saying, quote, "The Democrats are allowing a ridiculous asylum system and major loopholes to remain as a mainstay of our immigration system. Mexico is likewise doing nothing, a very bad combination for our country. Homeland Security being so very nice, but not for long." Apprehensions at the border have skyrocketed. In March, CBP was on track to apprehend more than 100,000 people crossing the border illegally. In a single day, there were more than 4,000 people who were apprehended. Lindsey Graham, who has long pushed for immigration reform, says he fully understands the president's threat to close the border. Listen here.
Well, I mean, what are we supposed to do? You have the Mexican government allowing thousands of people to walk all across Mexico. They provide them buses. They drop them off at the border, and they say, here, United States, deal with this problem.
The president is cutting off foreign aid to Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador because he says the governments there are not doing enough to keep people from fleeing their home countries. Democrats are vowing they are going to fight that and any attempt to close the border. Listen here.
When the president says he's going to close the border, that is a totally unrealistic boast on his part. What we need to do is focus on what's happening in Central America, where 3 countries are dissembling before our eyes and people are desperately coming to the United States. The president's cutting off aid to these countries will not solve that problem.
Now, Bill, there is a little bit of movement, I am told, in just the last few minutes. Mexico is taking steps to rejigger, if you will, its transit visa system. People who do not have papers to get to the United States will be turned around in that narrow part of southern Mexico and sent back to their home countries. I'm also told about this border closing idea, Bill. The president is very, very serious about this. Now, Mexico could avoid it because if it took some significant actions, the president might be willing to deal, but he is willing to suffer the consequences because he says we've got to do something about this immigration problem.